I
So
want to start today with a question, actually, which I think does sort of connect to current affairs in a way. I was thinking about the 1930s for all the horrific stuff that happened in the 30s. Artistically and culturally, it was a pretty rich era, and rich and interesting and enduring, not just in, classical music or literature, but, popular culture and film. A great deal of, the most beloved films of all time came from that era, in spite of the economic difficulties at the time. And I started thinking about that not long after the 2008 crisis, that, it was immediately apparent to me that there was a level of dislocation and disempowerment amongst the people that was that yeah, there were obvious, even 15 years ago, parallels with the 1930s. But one thing that was not a parallel is I don't feel like we are in a cultural golden age by any means. And in fact, if you think about, uh, the old adage, you are what you eat, you are what you consume. I worry very deeply that our cultural diet has been a major contributor to the moment that we find ourselves in. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
well, I have to confess I have a different view, a dimmer view of the 30s to begin with. I um my thinking has been increasingly I've been increasingly disenchanted with the 20th century, it seems, all my professional life, beginning with the discovery of the ferment in this country in classical music at the turn of the 20th century. I
Hmm.
realized something some time ago that surprised me completely, which was that, and I've written about this redundantly, that classical music in the United States peaked at the turn of the 20th century. The moment of the greatest promise and the greatest productivity was around 1900 or the 1890s in New York and in Boston, and everything went downhill after that. Basically, for me, the 30s was a time when classical music was popularized. And that was it could have been a noble endeavor, but it went awry in this country, partly because it was driven commercially. There was no BBC by people like David Sarnoff, who was a visionary and a music lover, but for him, classical music was about dead European masters. So you know this story, I've told it many times. So, so one thing about the 30s was that the democratization of culture was botched. The second thing about the 30s, I'm just talking about the United States, is that the composer was marginalized and tossed into the back seat, which hadn't happened before. And thirdly, I'm increasingly disenchanted with modernism. It's increasingly my opinion that modernism, although it may be a necessary turn, was in the long view a wrong turn. The dislocation that you talked about a moment ago was productive in many ways, and the arts often thrive on dislocation and adversity. It happened in Germany and Paris after the First World War, of course. It happened in Russia directly after the revolution. But in the long view, uh, I think a lot of this excitement proved kind of transitory, and that the lasting achievements in our field mainly transpired before the 20s, before the First World War, before these enormous upheavals of the Russian Revolution, World War I and World War II, which may have had some short-term benefits culturally, but long-term lineage and tradition were shattered. And that's what I find so unmooring today. Uh, I call what we've got left in music makeshift contemporary music. In this country, everybody's emphasizing contemporary music at a moment more when it's more shallow and insignificant than it's ever been before. It's precisely the wrong time to be playing a lot of contemporary American music. We need to be playing Ives. Ives is much fresher, more contemporary, more important to us than I won't name names, but everybody knows the names right now. They're names that'll be in the spotlight for a short period of time and then forgotten. Um, so I agree with you that all the things going wrong today include a cultural crisis, which is the least noticed and the least appreciated of our various crises. But I think its roots are very deep, Ken. I don't share the view of the 30s as a, well, we can talk about Sibelius because you just performed the Sixth Symphony.
At the end of the on CD.
The
Yeah,
story of Sibelius seems to me more important than at any prior moment in my professional life. I was born in 48, so I grew up with the notion that Sibelius could not be considered a, a top ranked 20th century composer. That berth was occupied by Arnold Schoenberg and Igor Stravinsky. And in this country, the writings against Sibelius by people like Virgil Thompson and Theodore Adorno, I mean, it's horrible to remember the things that were said. Adorno said that he could prove that Sibelius was not an important composer. Of course, he never undertook that demonstration. And Thompson viewed Sibelius as just incurably provincial. Sibelius is certainly not a provincial composer. You had a lonely voice like Constant Lambert in the United States, writing a book you probably know, Music Ho, in which he appoints Sibelius the musical genius of the 20th century, a view that at the time would have been considered eccentric, although he did have his champions. In this country, it was Olin Downs in the New York Times. But Downs' version of Sibelius is embarrassing. It's about, you know, the great man in the wilderness. Uh, Sibelius was nothing if not an original composer. And this piece that you just recorded, the Sixth Symphony, is nothing if not an original symphony. And what was the cost to Sibelius? So I am recently the author of an article in Musical Opinion. It just came out this week about Sibelius, Ives, and Elgar as victims of modernism. And how victimized were they? Well, in the case of Sibelius, if you read what people say, he was tormented by this challenge. You can see him responding to it in the Fourth Symphony and in the first version of the Fifth Symphony, trying to be a modernist, and then deciding, okay, the hell with it, and then deciding I'm not going to compose anymore. So I don't want to read too much into this because there were people, this is all in the piece that I wrote, who visited Sibelius when he wasn't doing much except, you know, gardening and drinking. And he seemed to Winthrop Sargent from the New Yorker when he visited him. I guess Sargent was not yet with the New Yorker. A happy guy. Uh, so maybe he was happy, but the fact is, he did stop composing. And the fact is, he's a towering figure. What are your thoughts at this moment about Sibelius, Ken?
Um, well, towering figure is a good place to start, I think. And I mean, I think one of the most brutal ironies about the case of Sibelius, especially in contrast to Schoenberg and Stravinsky and any number of other composers, Boulez, whose centenary was just being celebrated last week. But I can't think of any composer who paid a higher price to not repeat himself than Sibelius, except possibly Elgar, who ended up in a similar state of near silence. I mean, the pain that Sibelius went through to find something new to say in each major work, you know, up through Tapioa, which is also on this disc, you know, is incredible because he just couldn't let himself rewrite the last piece. And then you look at so much of the 20th century when folks like Adorno and the composers who sort of took up Adorno's ideas, it becomes almost the opposite. Like, let's find the perfect formula and churn out an infinite number of works that fit that formula. In a way, it's a bit like, I mean, you know, modernist architecture. You know, that the the whole idea was to create something that was replicable, that could be recycled over and over again. You could build the same apartment block in Berlin as in Paris as in New York, doesn't matter. You know, it's a box, it's functional. You know, you could write the same piece 20 times. And looking back, I feel like some of these, you know, supposed groundbreaking composers repeated themselves an awful lot. Um, and Sibelius didn't, and his music still sounds original and strange and totally unique. And you know, he has that very rare gift that he's a composer that, if you know his music at all, his sort of sonic fingerprint is there and super easy to spot in any piece from any period in his life. But the actual language and technique of what he did was constantly changing. Um, and yeah, I just think he's a much more enduring and original figure than most of the people that he was contrasted with. And I remember going to, I've told the story before, but when I went to Indiana University School of Music to audition when I was a high school student, they had a row of statues of the great composers outside the music school uh, along the roof of the building. And you know, sort of Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner, blah, 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 and then Sibelius. And the dean of the School of Music, no, sorry, as the dean of admissions, actually said to me, he's like, "Yeah, we keep thinking we really need to tear down that Sibelius statue. It's extremely embarrassing for the university to have it there." I just thought, you know, even then, I thought that was crazy. But you know, 40 years on from that conversation, it's just astounding that, you know, a school of music could get it so unbelievably wrong that they thought that that was a legitimate you know, concern that, having Sibelius on the building made them look old fashioned or silly.
You said something a few minutes ago that stuck in my ear. He was he was intent on not repeating himself, maybe to a unique degree. I mean, you can see him attempting over and over to say something new within the language that he was developing, and then deciding that he couldn't do it any longer. It's almost you can think of composers like Stravinsky is an obvious case who felt exhausted and so they turned the page, right? Sibelius, for whatever reason, was not going to turn the page, and when that page was exhausted, he just stopped writing on it. Is this unique?
Might be. I mean, I'm sure there are lesser known examples. I mean, there's the case of Schoenberg has one interesting similarity that
Yeah.
then branches out a totally different direction, which is you start out with a musical language that is very expansive and lush and rich, with Gurrlieder and Verklärte Nacht. And with each major piece, there's a sort of intensification of the moment to moment language and a shortening of the time span. So, by the time you get to the chamber symphony, it's less than half the duration of Pelléas and Melisande, much more intense and fiery. And he keeps sort of squeezing the language down to a point at which an explosion happens and he has to move on to atonality and the 12 tone system. And I mean, if you look especially at the second half of Sibelius's career, there's this distillation through the symphonies of, again, getting more compact. Everything that's inessential starts to go. And, by this, just, to look side by side at the Seventh Symphony and Tapioa as an example, you can see that, like, he's intensified the language in Tapioa to the point that I mean, where else could he have gone? Yeah.
Do you know the music of John Luther Adams?
Not well enough to comment on it. No.
So let's talk about John Luther Adams for a moment. He won a Pulitzer Prize, and right now he may be the most prestigious American composer. Uh, so his Pulitzer Prize piece is called "Become Ocean." And I happened to be talking to him the other day about my article about Sibelius and Elgar and Ives. And he confided to me that when he was composing Become Ocean, the only music he listened to was Tapioa by Sibelius.
Mm.
How does one pronounce the name of this piece? Is it Tapiola? I
I
don't.
well, when I ask my Finnish friends, it's something a little bit more clipped, like Tapiola. But
Okay, let's say Tapiola. Okay, so
yeah.
that's the only music he was listening to, and he's actually taken Sibelius, or at least some aspect of Sibelius, to some further point. His music is more abstract. You could say it's more distilled. What it has in common with Sibelius, this is something I'm writing now, is what Busoni called Ur Musik. Do you know this phrase, Ur Musik and Busoni?
I do, but I'd be curious how you would explain it to our listeners who
Yeah.
probably
So
don't.
here's Ferruccio Busoni, one of my favorite guys. Do you like Busoni?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In his essay on the essence of music, and he's got 2 pages which are unforgettable, talking about Ur Musik, Urmusik. And in German, this notion of Ur is something rooted and grounded and basic and elemental. And he says composers are always striving for this Ur Musik. Bach was pretty good at it. Uh, the most interesting example he cites is the transition to the fugue in the Hammerklavier Sonata, which, if you know it, and of course you know it,
Mhm.
the bottom falls out, and suddenly you're just in a cosmos of streaking atoms of sound without any bearings. There's no structure. And Busoni says, "That's it. That's the place you want to get to." And you can see he's trying in various pieces to get there. Um, but Sibelius in Tapiola, whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it. There's there's Ur Musik in that piece. Sure, on the one hand, it's a physical description of the tundra and the storm, but he's also trying to get underneath that to something more elemental. Wagner touches on it in the Forest Murmurs from Siegfried. So maybe. So maybe Schoenberg does at the opening of Girl Eater, but it's not an external description, it's an internal description of nature. Uh, John Luther Adams is definitely, who lived in Alaska for many years, is definitely going in that direction. And so, very interestingly, is Mr. Ives in his Universe Symphony, which I was discussing the other day with James Sinclair, the Ives scholar and conductor, where Ives abandons all references to hymn tunes and popular song and just is grappling with this Ur Musik, which he is also, he's there, he's in and out of it and things like that. Maybe this is a progeny of Sibelius, uh, something we would never have anticipated back in the modernist decades, that Sibelius, of all people, rather than being the statue that should be eliminated from the Jacob School of Music, was the was a prophet.
Well, I think he most certainly was. Um,
What's
you
he
know,
what's he prophesizing, Ken?
truth and silence sort of
Oh, right.
side.
Silence. I forgot. Busoni says the perfect example of Ur Musik is silence. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, of course, they were very good friends to
Oh
the
my
point.
God. You reminded me. Bingo. Yes. Right. They influenced one another.
They certainly did, and also socially. There's a famous story about I think Sibelius's wife writing to the promoter of a concert in Birmingham saying, "Under no circumstances let him go to dinner with Busoni," and they did, and they got completely shit
Yeah,
faced.
they
And
were both famous drinkers. Yes,
yeah,
Busoni was would ostensibly perform inebriated.
yeah, they were naughty naughty boys.
That's great. Yeah, imagine they influence one another and they're both tackling the same, very differently, I would say, the same goal of excavating something elemental. Uh,
Yeah, Busoni is another one. I mean, he's really been erased from the concert hall and musical life. um, to the point that he's almost, he's one of those composers that's sort of synonymous with eccentricity and uh, you know it, more known for the descriptions of his pieces than the actual.
well, the piano concerto gets a surprising number of performances.
Yeah, but I think as much as I mean, I'm not condoning this mindset, but I think it's partly the sort of Barnum and Bailey aspects of this, piano concerto with a chorus and with about 70 minutes of music or so. Um,
There are
it,
guys out there, Hamelin, Kirill Gerstein, uh, Igor Levit, who might actually have some impact. I don't know that there are conductors right now who are raising a banner, but it's just it's one of my many frustrations here in the U.S. is that his Indianist pieces aren't played. Better than his piano concerto is the Indian Fantasy for piano
mm,
and orchestra. Do you happen to know that piece?
I no, I don't.
It,
Um,
it's a magnificent poetic evocation and a terrific workout for the pianist. And it's virtually unknown. He's one of the important composers with Arthur Farwell and Antonin Dvorak, who in some way were impacted by Native America. They're
yeah,
impacted very differently. But I would say of all the hundreds or even thousands of composers who invoke Native America, the three outstanding composers in terms of their actual output. There's Dvorak in the New World Symphony, among other pieces.
mhm.
Arthur Farwell, who's been canceled because he's not politically correct, who's the closest thing to an American Bartok. And there's three pieces by Busoni, which are at the very least interesting pieces. And in the case of the Indian Fantasy, I think one of the most important pieces by any composer, I was going to say any American composer,
Do you
of the
know the story of a Danish American pianist, Gunnar Johansen?
I know that Johansen recorded all of Busoni in his basement.
Yeah. Well, his living room, but yeah.
Oh, it's in his living room. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Did you know him?
I met him once when I was a kid. He was an artist in residence at the University of Wisconsin, where I grew up.
Yeah,
Um, and I became more aware of him in the last sort of 5, 10 years, and wrote a long article on him the other day. But I find him really a fascinating figure. This sort of determination to, well, this music's not available, so I'm just going to record it all,
yeah,
and I'm going to do it myself. And it was a completely visionary endeavor in the sense, that long before you had artists putting up their own websites and uploading their records to Spotify and stuff, he found a way to do it in the 1950s and 60s, recording at home, shipping out LPs from his family basement. That's what was in the basement, was all the records.
Did he study with Busoni?
He studied not with Busoni, but with Egon Petri.
Well, Weil studied with Busoni,
Yeah.
and we must mention Ziggedy and Metropolis as people who were dedicated advocates for Busoni. Um, I'm completely seduced by Busoni.
Yeah. It's also like Sibelius, the music doesn't sound any less fresh for being 100 years.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Kurt Weill, did I already mention Kurt
Yeah.
Weill? People don't realize how much Weill was indebted stylistically to Busoni. A piece like Weill's Second Symphony definitely audibly influenced
Yeah.
by
And
Busoni. He revered.
quite a few of these composers that we're talking about, whether it's Busoni with the piano concerto or Sibelius with Finlandia or Kurt Weill with the Three Penny Opera, you end up, if you start to have a situation where composers really only thought of around one piece, it's so limiting in terms of understanding both who they really were, but also where they came from, because you might not detect the richness of influences that Weill had, by just looking at Mac the Knife. In fact, there's absolutely no chance that you would.